The conference was already behind schedule when Karoline Leavitt took the stage. Cameras clicked, lights flared, and her trademark smile, sharp, practiced, and just a bit condescending, settled over the room with an American flag at her back and a row of international leaders in front of her. She leaned into the mic and began what everyone expected, a clean, calculated jab at the man seated 2 chairs to her right. Ibrahim Traoré. There's a reason, she said, smirking, why some nations lead and others follow. And maybe, just maybe, it has something to do with clinging to outdated beliefs instead of embracing modern progress. Some in the audience laughed. Others winced. Traoré didn't flinch. Karoline continued, this time with a hint more edge. And when leaders still talk about land, soil, faith, and dignity as if those are political strategies, they're not leading, they're performing. That was the moment the room tilted because everyone turned toward Traoré, waiting. And still, he didn't speak. He just smiled. But it wasn't a smile of deflection. It wasn't polite. It was the kind of smile that didn't need a microphone. A calm, steady, immovable expression that said, "You're already proving my point." The moderator, clearly uneasy, shifted topics, but the tone had been set. Karoline thought she had landed the first punch. What she didn't realize was Traoré had been watching, not responding, preparing. He leaned back in his chair, hands clasped, gazed forward. Not toward Karoline, but toward the audience. He wasn't playing her game. He was about to rewrite the rules. By the time the panel reached its midpoint, Karoline was visibly enjoying herself. The crowd, especially her American supporters seated up front, chuckled each time she threw another thinly veiled insult across the stage. She'd studied the moment, planned her phrasing, even timed her eye rolls. This wasn't a debate. It was a show. And she believed she was the headliner. Belief systems are nice, she said sweetly, until they're used as excuses for corruption, stagnation, and emotional governance. Another smirk, another ripple of laughs. Then she looked straight at Traoré. Let's be honest, Mr. Traoré. The world isn't moved by dignity anymore. It's moved by results. And I don't see your beliefs producing any. Traoré slowly removed the earpiece, feeding him the live translations. He didn't need to hear more. He had heard enough. He finally turned his head toward Karoline. One motion measured slow and then silence. The kind of silence that makes people uncomfortable. The kind of silence that holds power. You've said enough. Traoré began, his voice low but sharp. Now, let me show you why you've been wrong from the start. There was no paper in front of him. No pre-written notes. What followed was not a speech. It was a reckoning. You say dignity doesn't produce results. Then I ask you, what did your wars produce? What did your democracy exports leave behind? Schools, stolen resources, and children raised under drones instead of skies. The audience went still. Karoline's smile flickered. You mock values because they don't fit in your spreadsheets. But I wasn't raised by spreadsheets. I was raised by people who still believe truth matters, buried their dead with honor, to look their children in the eye and say, you are not property. He paused. You believe in dominance. I believe in roots. One is loud. The other endures. The moderator tried to break the tension with a nervous chuckle, but the room wasn't laughing anymore. Traoré leaned forward, resting his hands on the table like a man who just flipped the script. Now tell me again who's stuck in the past. Karoline had been on stages before, plenty. She'd faced governors, senators, generals, but this was different. Traoré wasn't arguing. He was unveiling, and the room was no longer hers. She leaned back, arms crossed, but her body betrayed her. A slight clench of the jaw, a tightening around the eyes. It was the face of someone who realized her performance wasn't landing, it was unraveling. Still, she tried. Oh. You're saying faith and pride are enough to govern a nation? Jay said, voice a little sharper now. Good luck running a country on poetry. But Traoré didn't blink. You confuse faith with fantasy because yours was bought. Mine was earned. You talk about modernity like it's a substitute for morality. It's not. His voice didn't rise. It cut deeper because it didn't need to. It's what you call progress, he continued, often arrives wearing a uniform and demanding a signature. A quiet murmur rolled through the international press section. A French journalist lowered his camera. A Kenyan delegate nodded slowly. Even the moderator sat straighter in his chair. Karoline forced a laugh. Well, she said, it's easy to talk when you don't have a real seat at the table. And then Troy turned. For the first time, he looked her in the eye. It's no anger, no sarcasm, just wait. The table you speak of was built by slaves, funded by theft, and maintained by threats. And you call that leadership? The crowd didn't erupt, but it shifted like a tide changing. You mocked my beliefs, he added, because they weren't shaped in your institutions. But tell me, how do your institutions serve the poor, the forgotten, the hungry? No one answered. Dignity isn't currency to you, then perhaps that explains your bankruptcy. Karoline's mic was still on, but for the first time that evening, she had nothing to say. The moment Traoré said the word bankruptcy, a dozen phones shot into the air. Cameras were already rolling, but now everyone knew they were capturing history. Back in the US, the clip would be cut, subtitled, uploaded, and trending on X within hours. But in that room, it felt like time had slowed. Karoline tried to regain control, clearing her throat and lifting her chin as if preparing a final blow. It's easy to criticize from the outside, she said. But while we were building alliances, institutions, the very foundations of the free world, you were still clinging to sand and scripture. Gasps, audible ones, and Troy. He tilted his head slightly, almost amused. And yet he said calmly, you had to come to my continent for your minerals, your tech, your energy. So tell me again, who's clinging to what? Karoline's face stiffened. The moderator tried to pivot, asking the panel about future cooperation. But the air hadn't cleared. It had thickened. Let me tell you what cooperation looked like, Troy continued. It looked like treaties written in your language. It looked like loans with chains and fine print. It looked like aid delivered with cameras, but never when the cameras were off. This time, a few delegates clapped quietly, but deliberately. Karoline leaned forward, grasping for control. Then what do you want from us? It was the wrong question. Because Torres' eyes sharpened. His tone didn't change, but the words hit like a hammer. Nothing. That's the point. We want nothing. Not your approval, not your models, not your applause. You mock our values, but they've outlived your empires. The applause grew louder, sharper, like it had been waiting. The world isn't a stage where America writes all the lines. Some of us speak with silence, others with survival. Karoline went quiet. For once, the spotlight felt hot on her. It's too hot. And across the screen of every journalist in the room, a caption was being typed. Bold and brutal. He came without a script. He left with the room. The claps that followed two words weren't just protocol. They were protest, subtle, international, and unmistakably aimed at the old order Karoline represented. Delegates from Brazil, India, Algeria, and even South Korea joined in. Not a thunderous roar, but deliberate, measured enough to send a message. Karoline's smile returned, but this time it looked artificial, tight, unblinking. Her fingers tapped against the table as if they were searching for the next talking point. Something that could shift the tide back in her favor. But it was too late. Traoré leaned back in his chair. Not victorious, but centered, unshaken. This wasn't a victory lap for him. It was a necessary correction. The moderator tried to salvage balance. President Traoré, if you don't seek applause or approval, then what do you seek in these forums? Traoré turned to him, then slowly scanned the room. His answer wasn't a flourish, it was a scalpel. I came for the young ones watching at home. The ones being told their dignity is negotiable, their beliefs outdated. I came to show them it's not, Karoline interrupted, her voice taut. "You're romanticizing values that don't hold up in real policy. We live in a world of strategy, of realism, not sentiment." Traoré looked at her, then answered, not with heat, but clarity. "Strategy without soul is colonization by another name. Realism that discards humanity isn't strength, it's decay." The audience listened, leaning forward. "If your version of realism demands we abandon our history, our principles, our dignity, then we reject your reality." That line hit like an earthquake. One young journalist near the back whispered to her colleague, "That's going viral." Karoline tried one last time. "So you'd rather be respected for your values than powerful by our standards?" Dre didn't. Blink. Respect built on dignity lasts longer than power built on arrogance. Ask any empire that fell. The room went still again. And for Karoline, that silence hurt more than any word. The debate was no longer about economics or diplomacy, to become something deeper, almost primal, a confrontation between two visions of the world. One built on control, leverage, and hierarchy, the other on values, history, and pride. And Karoline, she could feel it. Her lines, once polished and praised in domestic press, were falling flat. Not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked resonance. They spoke to a world that no longer wanted to be spoken for. "The truth," she said, trying to regain footing, "is that we've maintained the world order for decades. Stability comes at a cost." "Yes, but it comes." Cray turned toward, her voice calm. "Stability for whom?" Karoline hesitated. "For global trade, for security." "Do you mean for global markets? And for borders that benefit you?" Troy said. "You call it order. We remember it as occupation." Her composure slipped. "You're rewriting history to play victim." "No," he said, "we're rereading it without your edits." A low murmur ran through the room. Even some American journalists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Trey leaned forward. "If your global order means our silence, our obedience, our erasure, then we choose disorder." The statement wasn't theatrical. It was personal. It's a reflection of centuries of erasure suddenly reclaimed in a sentence. Karoline attempted one final maneuver. "So what's your goal, Mr. Troy?" "A new world order." He didn't smile. He didn't grandstand. He simply replied, "No, just a world where dignity doesn't need your permission." And the crowd this time applauded loudly, not just politely. Not diplomatically. It was thunder. It was defiance. It was respect. Karoline sat back silent, not defeated, but undeniably. Repositioned because the stage wasn't hers anymore. And the world, it was listening to a different voice now. As the applause faded, the air didn't reset. It thickened with the sense that something irreversible had just happened. A geopolitical pH cleat. A geopolitical shift. Small perhaps, but undeniable. The kind that doesn't make headlines immediately, but lingers in memory. Karoline looked out across the room and saw it. Eyes that had once followed her cues were now watching Troy. He hadn't insulted her. He hadn't raised his voice. He'd simply refused to bow intellectually, morally, culturally, and it was working. The moderator hesitated, unsure of how to follow the moment. But Traoré relieved him of the burden. "The problem," he said, turning to the crowd, "is that many here are trained to think dignity is a weakness. That to resist exploitation is to be ungrateful." He didn't name names. He didn't need to. "But let me ask, what kind of gratitude is demanded? At gunpoint. What kind of partnership needs a leash?" Karoline sat still, her jaw tense, her expression tight. "I've seen villages rise from dust without a single Western grant. I've watched young men build schools with bare hands and borrowed tools. That's not weakness. That's survival. That's resilience." He turned his attention back to Karoline. "What you mock as belief, we live as necessity. It's not a luxury for us to have pride. It's how we stay human in a world that tried to make us forget we were." Karoline responded, not with her usual fire, but a quieter tone. You speak with conviction. But conviction doesn't build infrastructure. Traoré nodded. And yet conviction is what tells people they deserve it. Without that, no structure stands. A moment passed, and for the first time Karoline seemed to hear, not just listen. You came here to challenge me, she said. But maybe you challenge more than that. He didn't gloat. Kay simply offered. I came to remind you, can everyone watching that respect is not a currency you get to mint alone. That line echoed through the hall, printed instantly in headlines, quoted across continents. Karoline didn't respond. Not out of defeat, out of understanding. Something had shifted, and the cameras captured it all. Once the panel ended, the cameras powered down, but the tension remained. Reporters scrambled to file early pieces. Diplomats whispered to aides. Analysts checked social feeds. Something unusual was happening in real time. Traoré's words were spreading faster than anyone expected. Not just in African capitals, but in Western ones too. Karoline made her way to the exit, pausing briefly near a journalist from The Guardian. Was that how you thought it would go? The reporter asked quietly. Karoline gave a short smile. Professional, but thin. I thought I was coming to defend ideas. Turns out I was defending habits. In the corner of the room, Traoré stood surrounded not by security or yesmen, but by students, translators, and young activists. They weren't there for photos. They were asking questions, real ones. How do you balance strength and humility? Can you lead without resentment? What do we do when people say we're not enough? And he answered them, not as a politician, but as someone who remembered what it felt like to be overlooked. You don't wait to be enough for them. You become undeniable for yourself. Meanwhile, Karoline was ushered into a smaller media lounge for a scheduled debrief. But something in her posture had changed. Not defeat, but recalibration. A producer whispered, "Want to shift messaging?" She shook her head. "No, I want to listen to that clip again." And back in the main hall, as janitors swept the stage, and technicians unplugged wires, a phrase was being replayed on 1,000 phones. Respect is not a currency you get to mint alone. It had already been mead, translated, quoted. But its power wasn't in the virality. It was in the reaction it provoked, especially in those who never expected to feel anything at all. Karoline's team wanted damage control, but deep down she knew this wasn't about damage. It was about reality finally catching up to the narrative. And Traoré, he wasn't just part of the story anymore. He was changing who got to write it. In Washington, think tanks called emergency rounds. In Paris, columnists tried spinning the debate as symbolic. In Nairobi, the streets buzzed with pride. But in Karoline Leavitt's inner circle, the only thing spreading faster than spin was silence. She sat in a dim briefing room watching a replay of the event on a loop. Her eyes weren't focused on Traoré singers. They lingered on something else: his calm, his refusal to blink, his ability to deliver humiliation without hatred. Her aide leaned in. "We can issue a statement. Clarify your position." Karoline shook her head. No, this wasn't about policy. It was about posture. Elsewhere, Traoré was already in a follow-up session. Not with world leaders, but with representatives from underrepresented nations. His remarks weren't rehearsed. They were grounded, relatable. "They call it world order," he said. "But they only invite you after the table's set, and they've already eaten." Laughter. Not mocking, but cathartic, he added. "What we want isn't to flip the table for chaos. We want to build our own with our own wood, our own hands." That line was clipped, shared, and replayed across dozens of platforms. Back in the States, conservative anchors tried to spin the event as emotional overreach by a third-world populist. But something was off. The audience wasn't biting. Even younger conservatives weren't mocking. They were curious. He wasn't angry. One user posted, "He was right." Karoline watched. That comment scrolled by and exhaled. "We built the stage," she whispered. "But he rewrote the script." That admission didn't come with tears. It came with clarity. For years, she had stood on stages like these, assuming the world wanted her version of order. Now, she wasn't so sure. And Troy, he wasn't interested in taking her place. He was interested in ending the game. 10 days later, Traoré walked alone through a hallway lined with journalists in Geneva. No entourage, no fanfare, just presence. Reporters shouted questions, some respectful, some desperate for controversy. "President Troy, do you believe you won the debate?" He paused, looked directly into the camera. It wasn't a contest, it was a mirror. He kept walking. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt appeared on a morning news panel in D.C., seated between two hosts who expected her to reclaim narrative control. One of them asked sharply, "Do you regret underestimating him?" Karoline didn't flinch. "I don't regret debating him. I regret thinking he came to debate." Silence. He didn't want to win. He wanted us to see what we'd become. The clip exploded online. Some called it her most human moment. Others said it was the sound of an era cracking. That same night, Traoré addressed a youth summit. No teleprompters, just a wooden stage and a sea of skeptical, energized faces. "They'll tell you to be reasonable," he said. "What they mean is be small. Let that breathe. But you weren't born to be reasonable in someone else's story. You were born to build your own." One girl stood up and asked, "How do you know we'll be heard?" Traoré smiled, not with arrogance, but certainty. "You're already being heard." "Why, they're nervous." From the back of the room, someone clapped, then another. Then the room stood together. Not in choreography, but instinct. No anthem played, no slogan chanted. Just the echo of dignity filling a space where permission was never needed. In a world where power often mocks principle, Ibrahim Traoré reminded us that dignity doesn't ask for permission. Karoline Leavitt came with rehearsed lines. He came with lived truths. This wasn't a clash of nations. It was a clash of intentions. Control versus conviction, mockery versus meaning. And in the end, it wasn't volume that won. It was the voice that never flinched. Traoré didn't just answer her. He reframed the question. And maybe that's what real leadership looks like.